So today we're joined by Dr. Joel Lexchin, who received his medical degree from the University of Toronto in 1977. He's a professor emeritus in the School of Health and Policy and Management at York University in Toronto, Canada, where he taught health policy until 2016. In addition, he worked for the emergency department at the University Health Network, also in Toronto, for over 34 years. He's published two books since 2016, the first of which is Private Profits versus Public Policy, the Pharmaceutical Industry and the Canadian State. This was published in 2016, and the second was Doctors in Denial, Why Big Pharma and the Canadian Medical Profession Are Too Close for Comfort, published in 2017. He's a member of the Foundation Board of Health Action International and the Board of Canadian Doctors for Medicare. He's also a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences and is among the top 2% of the world's most highly cited researchers. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Lexchin.
Okay, my pleasure. Um, so before I get started, let me just say that, well, I know a lot about the pharmaceutical industry. My knowledge of the American healthcare system is not nearly as deep. Your system is crazy, and it's impossible to keep up with all the ins and outs. So if you ask me about the drug industry, fine. If you ask me about the American healthcare system, I may have to pass on that. And if I slip into medical speak, um, just ask questions and I'll try and explain what I mean. Okay, so let me get up my slides.
Perfect.
All right. Okay, so as I was saying, drug companies don't just make drugs, they also make knowledge. And it's the production of knowledge that I'm going to be talking about because knowledge is what drives the use of medications. How do we know what drugs to prescribe? How do we identify diseases? And all that comes down to the control of what knowledge gets out there. So before I talk about all that, just some conflicts. These were, you heard about them. So there is no money involved. The royalties pay for a cheap bottle of wine a year, and that's about it. All right. So, what is the reality of new drugs? And when I talk about reality, what I'm talking about is how much additional therapeutic benefit do we get from new drugs compared to what's already on the market? And this is Canadian data that covers from 2010 to 2023. But the situation is the same in any developed country, the US, Australia, Western Europe, etc. So the blue are the drugs that really make a difference. These are major therapeutic advances. And as you can see here, there are about between 10 and 15% of new drugs that are introduced annually fall into that category. So that's about 1 in 7 or 1 in 8. The orange are the ones that are moderate therapeutic advantages, and the gray, which is the one, are the minor or no therapeutic advantage, and that's by far the majority of the drugs that are out there. So how do the drug companies convince us to use all those in the gray area, the ones that make no difference to the patient's health, but cost a lot more money? And let's just go back for a minute and talk about drugs, how much additional value we get from drugs. So this is American data now, and this is a paper that I published with a couple of other people just recently. The FDA has a category called breakthrough drugs, which make it sound like they're going to raise people from the dead or almost do that. But in fact, even with drugs that are called breakthroughs, the majority or the plurality of those are still of minor therapeutic benefit. The ones that are of major therapeutic benefit are the smallest group. So even what's called a breakthrough drug is not necessarily going to be of any more value to your patients. But that's not what the drug companies want us to think. The drug companies want us to think that every new drug that comes out there is a home run. And how do they get us to think like that? And the way they do it is largely through what's called ghost management. So you may have heard about ghost writing, which is where the companies actually write the journal articles and then find doctors who are willing to sign their names to them. But ghost management is more than that. Ghost management goes all the way back to um, designing the clinical trials. The clinical trials are set up such to make the drug look good and to make the drug look good for markets where the companies think that they'll be able to sell the most product. So the clinical trials are not necessarily designed for what is the greatest medical need. They're designed to produce results that'll lead to the greatest financial benefit for the companies. So they design the clinical trials, they analyze the data, they use ghostwriters to produce the articles. They hire researchers and physicians to go around the country speaking to groups of doctors about the drugs. These doctors are not independent. They use slides and scripts that come from the drug companies. They pay patient organizations to lobby on behalf of the drugs. They have publication planners who figure out which journals the articles should go into. They set up their own medical journals. There are fake medical journals that are out there. Um, and they may have interactions with publishers of medical journals. So we're going to go through most of these ways of ghost management. And the key to understanding what the drug companies are able to do is the Willie Sutton rule. I'm not old enough to know to have ever heard about Willie Sutton directly, but Willie Sutton was a bank robber in the US in the 1930s. And the story goes that when they finally caught Willie, one of the reporters who was around came up to him and asked him, why did he rob banks? And Willie's answer was, that's where the money is. So when you're thinking about the pharmaceutical area, you have to think about where the money is. And where the money is with the drug companies. The drug companies are enormously profitable. For the past 30 years or so, if you look at the Fortune 500 companies, the most profitable industries, the drug companies are amongst the top three industries in terms of profitability. But those profits don't all go into doing more research and development. In fact, if you analyze what the largest drug companies do with their profits, you can see that what they do is they spend more money on stock buybacks. In other words, the companies buy existing stock to reduce the number of shares. You reduce the number of shares, you drive up the value of the remaining shares. Driving up the value of the remaining shares increases the income of the senior executives at the drug companies because the senior executives are largely paid but in terms of shares. You pay out cash dividends to people who own shares, senior executives again, and then you use money for research and development. So if you go to the bottom of this slide and you add up the figures, over this 10-year period, 2012 to 2021, what you'll see is that over 700 billion was spent on share buybacks and cash dividends compared to 600 billion for R&D. So when you hear drug companies complain that if prices are lower, there won't be enough money to do R&D, you can just tell them to stop spending so much money on share buybacks and dividends, and they'll be fine for R&D. So the drug companies have the money, and they use that money when they do R&D to invest in products that have the greatest sales potential. So this is just looking at what new products are introduced into the world market. This goes from 2000 to 2012. And out of 850 new products that were introduced into the world market, 37, that's under 5%, we're focused on what are called neglected diseases. These are diseases that primarily occur in low and middle income countries. So think about schistosomiasis, malaria, even TB. And why are there so few products for neglected diseases? Because the people in those countries don't have the money to spend on drugs. If you look at World Health Organization figures about per capita spending on prescription drugs in low income countries, it's about $30 per person per year, which may buy you enough antibiotics, for instance, for 5 days. And once you've done that, that's it for you for the rest of the year. There's no more money for prescription drugs. And by the way, that situation for people with things like HIV is going to get even worse since US aid got cut by the Trump administration. Even in developed countries, drug companies do not invest in R&D in the areas that people think are most necessary. So this looks at osteoarthritis of the knee. This is a pretty common condition in people my age. Knees wear out. We need to do something about it. So when you ask different groups of either clinicians what they would like to see in terms of R&D, the rheumatologists say that NSAIDs, nonsteroidal anti-inflammatories, are over-researched. Patient groups want more invested in physiotherapy, education, self-help. GPs think that oral drugs like NSAIDs are over-researched. Physiotherapists want more research into physiotherapy and exercise, but where does the money actually go? And this is looking at um, the where the money is being spent. So by far, the most money goes into oral drug or went into oral drugs. And that's because all these other things, except possibly for injected drugs, either can't be patented or don't make as much money as drugs. So the drug companies put their money not into where patient groups and clinicians would like to see it, but into where they think they're going to get the most money. And so when we talk about ghost management, one of the first steps is preparing the market. So a drug company is looking at introducing a new product onto the market. And one of the first things that they'll do before they've even completed their clinical trials is they'll start laying the groundwork for that. So this is an example of how one company did it. A researcher at at Georgetown University was approached asking if she would write an article about the problems, about the interactions between herbs and warfarin. And there are interactions that can increase the anticoagulating effect of warfarin. And they wanted her to write an article about this problem. But she wanted to know, so why do you want this article? And when she didn't get an answer, she refused to write the piece. And it turns out that the drug company that asked her to do it wanted her to write this article because they were planning on introducing a set or a drug, an oral anticoagulant, which acted in a different manner than warfarin and didn't have its safety problems. So they wanted to tell people that warfarin could be potentially dangerous. You had to watch out. You had to monitor the what's called INR on a constant basis to make sure that the INR wasn't too high, could cause major bleeds. They wanted years before they introduced their new drug. They wanted to get the idea into doctors' heads that warfarin is dangerous and that alternatives were a better idea. And when we come to clinical trials, we have to look at who's paying for the clinical trials, and especially who pays for clinical trials that are the basis for getting drugs approved. And virtually, this shows that even for all clinical trials, the drug companies, Big Pharma and Small Pharma, are the major funders. And for clinical trials, for pre-market clinical trials, pharma pays for about 100% or just under 100% of all of those trials. They control those trials. They decide who is going to conduct them. They own the data. They will analyze the data. They will decide where the data can be published and in what form the data will be published. And we'll go through some of these things in a few minutes. But when you look at the clinical trials and you look at what are the results of those trials and what are the conclusions of those trials, and then you look at who paid for the trials, not surprisingly, what you find is that when the drug companies have paid for the trials are more likely to have positive results and positive conclusions than when anybody else pays for those trials. Charities, national research foundations, the NIH, hospitals, drug company trials are more likely to have positive results and positive conclusions than trials paid for by anybody else. And that's the result. Those are conclusions from a Cochrane review that I was part of. So why are industry-sponsored trials much more positive? And it's not because of the standard measurements of quality of trials. So we look at blinding, we look at randomization, things like that. Industry trials do just as well as non-industry trials in those areas. The differences are more subtle. So there's the choice of comparators. If you're comparing a new drug to a placebo, it's much easier to show that the drug is beneficial when the placebo isn't. Or you pick a non-first line comparator, something that is only used when the first line fails, and you compare the new drug to non-first line comparators. You choose a dose of the comparator that's too high or too low. Too high, more side effects. Too low, doesn't work very well. What gets measured? A lot of new drugs, especially oncology drugs, the clinical trials use what are called surrogate endpoints. These are things like progression-free survival. So, how long does it take a tumor to get bigger? That's progression-free survival. That doesn't necessarily correlate with how long are you going to live. But if you choose a surrogate endpoint, it's easier to show that your drug is positive, has effects. How long does the trial go on for? Most clinical trials, at best, go on for about a year. But side effects may take a lot longer to develop than that. I've looked at drugs withdrawn from the market. Some drugs, the side effects, serious side effects, are only recognized 5 years, 10 years after the drug has been on the market. So if your clinical trial is just 1 year, you're not going to see those side effects. And finally, publication bias. What gets published and what doesn't. Remember, the drug companies own the data and they decide how the data is going to be written up and when it's going to be published. And if you want to read more about this, every year the BMJ, British Medical Journal, has a Christmas issue, which is full of satirical articles. And a number of years ago, one of those articles was about Harlot PLC. Harlot PLC was the fictitious name of an organization which will help drug companies figure out how to generate and manipulate data to their benefit. And if you go to the BMJ, the reference that's down there, you can read the article. It's actually quite funny. Yeah. Another way that the drug companies make sure that the results of their trials are positive is through relationships with the senior author on a paper. And this article here looked at um, over 100 um, controlled clinical trials and looked at whether or not the lead author had a financial relationship with the company that paid for the article or with the drug that was being studied. And what they found was that if the lead author had a financial relationship, again, the results of the trials were more likely to be positive than if they didn't have a financial relationship. This doesn't imply that the lead authors were bribed or bought, but if you want to get a drug, if you want to have a result of a drug or the result of a clinical trial look good, you don't go to somebody who has been critical of that drug. You go to somebody who has said good things about the drug independently of the drug company. And when they do the trial, because they've already had they think that the drug is a benefit, the trial is more likely to show that. Drug companies hide the results of trials that they don't like. So I'm sure that most of you have heard about Vioxx, Rofecoxib, which is the generic name. And one of the things that Merck, the makers of Vioxx, try was thinking about was that Vioxx might be beneficial in delaying the onset of Alzheimer's. This was based on an idea that at least one of the part of the pathophysiology behind Alzheimer's was inflammation in the brain. So they gave people Vioxx to see if it would have an effect. Um, the trial actually showed that there was an increase in mortality amongst people who were taking Vioxx compared to those who were using placebo. And Merck dismissed those results to the FDA with this quote, small numeric differences consistent with chance fluctuations. So, in other words, Merck said that Vioxx didn't really have an effect on mortality. But in fact, that wasn't the case. And you can see here the difference in mortality over time between Vioxx and placebo, and it just kept getting wider and wider. So Merck lied about this. Another way that the trials are biased is when they're not actually designed to produce any valid scientific information. What they're designed to do is to get doctors to start using drugs. And then once the trial is over, the hope is that doctors will keep using those drugs. These are called seeding trials. In other words, you plant a seed, which is you can get the doctors into the study, and you hope that seed grows into the idea that this is the drug that should be used even once the trial is over. The trials have no scientific merit. They're only designed to increase sales. And here's an example of one seeding trial. This was called Advantage. Again, this involves Merck and Vioxx. It was written up in the Annals of Internal Medicine, and I'm not going to read the quote, But basically, what the quote says is that this trial, again, was only designed to get doctors to use Vioxx, not designed to generate any kind of clinical information that would be useful. And marketing trials, seeding trials, are not just published in obscure medical journals, they're published in major medical journals. So about a decade ago, a group of researchers, and this included editors of some of the major medical journals in the world, so the British Medical Journal, PLOS Medicine, investigated where seeding trials got published. And you can't be sure that it's a seeding trial, but there are characteristics that you can look for which would strongly suggest that they are. So they looked at these major medical journals, Annals of Internal Medicine, JAMA, the New England Journal of Medicine, PLOS Medicine, and they examined a whole range of articles of clinical trials in these journals and said what's likely to be a seeding trial. And you can see there that 21% of the trials that they examined or that they looked at, they thought were seeding trials, including 21 that appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine, the major medical journal in the world. So seeding trials get into the big journals, get cited, get read, if not read directly, get used in talks, and plant the idea that a drug is the best therapy for a particular condition when that's not what the trial was designed to do. You don't like the results of the trials, you reframe them to make them look good. And that occurred with another non-steroidal anti-inflammatory called celecoxib or Celebrex. This is another, as I said, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. The idea behind Celebrex was that it would cause less damage to the gastrointestinal tract. In other words, it would cause less GI bleeding than traditional NSAIDs like ibuprofen or naproxen. And this trial got published in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, and the 6-month result looked pretty good. It looked like there was definitely less GI bleeding with celecoxib than there was with traditional NSAIDs. But it turned out that the trial wasn't designed to run for 6 months. It was designed to run for 12 months. The authors had used only the first 6 months worth of data because at 12 months, Celebrex was no better than traditional anti-inflammatories at preventing GI bleeding. Drug companies will also not even bother publishing results if the trials don't turn out the way they want. So this is a trial that looked at whether or not Paxil, um, which is an SSRI, serotonin, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So does Paxil work in children and adolescents who have depression, and is it safe? And one of the studies was study 329. And there was another study. And you can see there at the bottom, these studies didn't turn out necessarily the way that the drug companies wanted them to, so they didn't bother submitting them to regulatory authorities. Studies were negative, no use to the drug company in getting the indications approved, so they're not going to send them to the FDA or in Canada to Health Canada. And here again is the a quote from company documents that had to be released because of court cases. It would be commercially unacceptable to include a statement that an effect had not been demonstrated, as this would undermine the profile of paroxetine. Paroxetine is Paxil. One researcher who had been involved in these trials wrote a letter about them to the Canadian Medical Association Journal, and pointed out that she knew that the drug didn't work, but she couldn't say anything because she had signed a non-disclosure agreement with the company making the product. So companies use non-disclosure agreements to stop people from saying things that would harm the sales of their products. You can change another way of changing the conclusions that I've already mentioned is you only publish the positive results. So there were a group of researchers who got access to to the data around 74 studies that were submitted to the FDA in support of antidepressants. So out of those 74 studies, 38 were positive. In other words, they showed that the antidepressant worked. 37 of those 38 were published, and one wasn't. There were 12 studies who had questionable results. In other words, you couldn't be sure whether or not the antidepressant worked or didn't work. Out of those 12, 6 were published, but the article in the medical journals did not agree with what the drug companies had told the FDA. In other words, the results in the medical journals were spun in a positive direction, and 6 studies weren't published at all. And there were 24 negative trials that were submitted to the FDA. In other words, in the data that the FDA got, it said that these trials showed that the antidepressants did not work. 3 were published that said the antidepressants didn't work. 5 were published that said the antidepressant actually did work, and 16 were never published. So again, you control the data, you decide which data are going to be published, and you also control what the published articles are going to say. So let's look at some of the how the clinical trials are designed, how many are required to get a drug on the market. And this is Canadian data, but there are articles in the US that show the same thing. And the regulatory or the data that is acceptable to regulatory authorities, in this case it's Health Canada, but it might be the FDA, are heavily influenced by the industry. So you can, at the top, you can see how many pivotal trials were required to get a drug on the market. A pivotal trial is the one that the FDA or Health Canada says is the most significant trial. And the number has gone down from two trials to one trial. So all you need is one good trial and you can get your drug approved. It doesn't matter whether or not a second one would show the same thing because you don't have to do it. Trials are done in three phases. So phase one is you're testing doses on healthy volunteers. Just you want to be sure that the dose is safe. Phase two is designed to show some degree of efficacy. And phase three are the main trials, the ones with the large number of people that are the most important. And the percentage of phase three trials, the most important ones, has been going down over the years. The percentage of randomized trials has been going down over the years, and the percentage of blinded trials has been going down over the years. So, what we're seeing here is that the trials that drug companies are using to get their drugs on the market are not nearly as strong currently as they were a decade or two ago. And those standards, again, remember, are being influenced by the drug companies. And how are they being influenced? Because one of the ways is in the United States, 60% of the cost of the FDA's budget for regulating prescription drugs comes not from Congress, but from user fees that the drug companies are paying. So every time a drug company wants to get a new drug on the market, it has to pay the FDA $4 million. And their FDA gets money from a variety of other things that it does, inspect drug company plants, um, a whole bunch of things. 60% of its budget to run the prescription, to monitor and regulate prescription drugs comes from the drug companies. Well, just a couple of other points about the trials. Very few clinical trials are what are called superiority trials. In other words, they don't show that the new drug is better than existing drugs. What they show is that it's non-inferior. In other words, it's no worse. Or you have single arm trials. And in other words, it's only the new drug that's being tested. It's not being tested against anything else. So you can't judge whether or not it's any better. And finally, the percentage of trials that are based on hard clinical outcomes. So a hard clinical outcome is, does the person live longer or is their quality of life better? And that the percentage of trials with those outcomes is going down. So the new drug, the FDA is using data which is not that good to approve new drugs. Earlier on, I talked about um, fake medical journals. So we're going back to Vioxx for a minute. Elsevier is probably the world's largest medical journal publisher. And Merck paid Elsevier money to create fake medical journals to publish. This is the fake medical journal, the Australasian Bone and Joint Journal of Bone and Joint Medicine. And it created this journal to publish articles about that were positive for Vioxx. I mentioned ghostwriting. This is just a flow diagram that shows how ghostwriting works. So first of all, you hire the medical writer who outlines the article. The medical writer will have a PhD. They'll be given the data by the drug company. They'll be told what the message should be. They'll outline their article. The drug company will decide whether or not that outline meets their criteria. If it does, then the medical writer drafts the article. The sponsor then, or in other words, the drug company then looks at what the medical writer, the draft, and if they like it, then they send the article to a guest author, somebody who signs, who's willing to put their name on the medical article, either because they're being paid to do so or because it adds to their CV if they're looking for promotion or they're trying to apply for grants. If the author agrees to put their name, the sponsor approves that, and then the article is submitted to the medical journal and will eventually get published. And an example of ghostwriting, this is a look at another SSRI, sertraline, and the current medical directions is a company that specializes in helping drug companies get articles published in medical journals. And you can see there um, that the article is being written or has been written, and the author is TBD, in other words, to be determined. So, who is willing to be bought to put their name on this article? Key opinion leaders. These are the men and women who are hired by drug companies to give talks, usually with a meal, a good meal, not a bad meal. You're not going to McDonald's. There will probably be some nice wine available. So you eat and then you drink. And then if you're still awake, the key opinion leader is giving their talk. As I said earlier, the key opinion leader uses slides from the drug companies and uses a script prepared by the drug companies. And if the key opinion leader doesn't generate enough in sales, and the drug companies know this because they buy data from pharmacies and they can look at what happened in the area um, to sales in the area where the key opinion leader was giving a talk. So if the sales don't go up enough, then that key opinion leader is just not asked to do any more speaking, and the drug companies look for somebody else. Drug companies bias a whole bunch of the ways that we learn about drugs. So, clinical practice guidelines. Clinical practice guidelines are supposed to help us as doctors diagnose problems and figure out which is the best treatment for them. But the committees that develop clinical practice guidelines almost always have people on them who have financial relationships with the company making the product. So you can see here that depending on which what area of medicine you're talking about, the majority, it may be that the majority of people on these committees have a financial relationship with drug companies. So neurology, oncology, gastroenterology, orthopedic surgery. Well, orthopedic surgery would be device companies probably. Um, but the majority of people on these committees have a relationship with the company that's making the product. If you look at who is sponsoring cost-effective analysis, so cost-effective analysis is are the benefits of the drug worth the amount of money that we're willing to spend? And in the US, that's generally speaking about $100,000 for what's called a quality adjusted life year. So for one good year of life, one more good year of life, in other words, either extended life or a life with significantly improved symptoms, are we willing to spend $100,000 per person for that? And if the drug companies have sponsored these cost-effective analysis, the answer is typically yes. If drug companies have sponsored, they never say, or almost never say, that it's not worth spending that money. I'm sure that most of you have heard the term meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is just means that you have been able to statistically combine the results of a bunch of trials to come up with a conclusion, because the individual trials um, are too small to let you reach a definite opinion about how beneficial the drug is. So this looked at meta-analyses of a drug for diabetes there were two of them that were looked at. One of them was sponsored by a drug company. That's the one on the left. The conclusion was clinically meaningful weight loss, generally well tolerated. Sorry, this wasn't a diabetes drug, this was a weight loss drug. And the one on the right, same drug, but not paid for by a drug company, increases the risk of psychiatric adverse events, recommend increased alertness of physicians to these potentially severe psychiatric adverse reactions. So completely different results dependent on who paid for the meta-analysis. Biasing CME, continuing medical education. Right now, both in Canada and the United States, if you want to maintain certification in either general practice or a specialty, you have to accumulate a certain number of hours of continuing medical education per year. Usually it's about 50 hours a year. And you can do that either by going to um, industry-sponsored CME, which means that you don't have to pay, or the amount of money that you have to pay is significantly reduced, or you can go and get it through something like Harvard, which is not paid for by drug companies, but it costs a lot more money. So if you go, a lot of people go to the industry sponsored ones. And leaving aside whether or not industry sponsored CME is the content is going to be biased, the the focus of those CME events is going to be biased. It's going to be biased in favor of things that are going to make the drug companies money. So you can look there and you can see there were only 30 topics covered by drug companies, over 130 covered by Harvard, and the majority of the sessions that were paid for by drug companies covered, not surprisingly, drug therapy. But that wasn't the case for Harvard. So even if the information that you're going to get is accurate from the drug company CME, and there's some good evidence that it's not, but even if it were, you're only going to learn about a narrow range of you're only going to get a narrow range of information from drug company CME about a particular topic. And that's going to be how do you treat it with drugs, not how do you diagnose it, how do you prevent it, non-drug or non-clinical areas. Drug companies do not like it when people criticize their products, criticize them openly, publicly. And this article here that you can see the reference in the top right-hand corner looked at about 25 or 30 examples of where people had been openly critical about products made by companies and what happened to those people. So, about 2.5 decades ago, there was a there were weight loss combination called fenfluramine, and phentolamine were being um, marketed by Wyeth for weight loss. There were some doctors in Montreal, here in Canada, who were very critical of that. And so the Wyeth said at the bottom, it would be a good idea for you, the medical affairs director, to prepare a series of action that could neutralize these gentlemen. Back to Merck, doctor at Stanford, who was critical of Vioxx, and Merck told this doctor, or said that if this doctor continued to deliver anti-Vioxx talks, he would flame out and there would be consequences for Stanford. Critics of drug companies get sued. And if you want to read more in general about this topic, these are some readings that you can go to. And if you want even more information, this is a book that was just published. I get no royalties from it. I've met Jerry Avorn once or twice, so I hardly know him. But if you want to read more about the problems with the pharmaceutical area in the US, I would highly recommend that you go out and buy a copy of this book. And that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Lexchin. Very informative talk. I'll wait for everyone to get their cameras back on, and then I'll go ahead and start off the discussion.
Sure.
So the first question I have is, throughout this internship, part of it is evaluating other countries' health systems and understanding, maybe try to get inspiration kind of from them. And part of that was we realized, or we were able to learn in the EU specifically, they have like a FDA type counterpart that evaluates safety and F safety. And then each individual's country will typically have its own like sort of nationalized drug evaluation organization that'll approve drugs for their national formulary based off of efficacy. Um, which seems maybe like it would be more resistant to some of the factors that you're describing, but I'd like to clarify if they are like fall victim to similar issues as the United States and Canada, or if they're more insulated from it.
Okay, so the most of the drugs, the vast majority of drugs that are introduced onto the EU market, the European market, and actually there were a couple of countries that are not in the EU. Norway is one of them that also use the EMA evaluation. So the European Medicines Agency makes a decision about whether or not to allow a drug to be marketed in the countries that are part of the EU. But the drug companies themselves decide whether or not to introduce that drug onto a national market. So the EMA may say, we approve drug X, but the company that makes drug X may not think that the market is big enough in some smaller country, like let's say Serbia, and they won't bother to market it. Or they'll market it 2 years after they get approval, after the EMA has approved it. The larger markets will see the drug get introduced much quicker because the drug companies can make more money. And once the drug companies have decided to market the drug, then it has what's called a health technology assessment. So the US does not do this. Congress has explicitly forbidden any kind of federal agency from doing a health technology assessment. But a health technology assessment is a value for money assessment. In other words, does the drug give enough value? Is it safe enough to pay for it for that individual market? And HTA assessments are done on a national basis. So the body that does it in Spain, for instance, may say, well, the drug may help, but at $1 million a year, we can't afford it. Whereas the HTA body in Germany may say, we can't afford it. Um, so it's a two-step process. First, the drug companies have to get the drug approved based on how well it works and how safe it is. And then secondly, on a national market, they have to get it approved for public financing um, based on whether or not it delivers enough value that the country thinks that it's worth paying for.
And then the follow-up is, has that process been more insulated from the effects of pharma and pushing through drugs that don't necessarily improve patient outcomes, or has it been susceptible to the same um, market like manipulation?
Yeah. So I'm not aware of anybody who has done a detailed study into this, but my expectation is that yes, it has, that there are drug, the US sees more new drug introductions on an annual basis than any other country in the world. And that's because you get more money from the US than you do from any other country in the world because of the price. So because you the countries in Europe aren't as willing to pay these high prices, you don't see as many drugs. So I think that it probably has reduced the number of especially um, introductions of new drugs that don't really have much value, additional therapeutic value. But again, as I said, as far as I know, there hasn't been any detailed look at this.
And then Anana.
Thanks, Zach. I was just wondering, this is the first time I've heard about ghost management, and it's shocking, to say the least. Do you think moving forward, there's any way to regulate it or any room for reform?
Um, sure, there's always room for ways to reform it. Um, but what the the stumbling block is political will. So if you look at, again, we're looking at the US, there are more drug company lobbyists than there are members of Congress. The drug companies spend more money lobbying um, than any other association in the US. The person, if you go back a number of years, about 20 years, a little more than 20 years ago, the US introduced what's called Medicare Part D, which was the payment for, or the partial payment for prescription drugs, outpatient prescription drugs for people 65 and over. One of the pieces in that legislation said that Medicare could not negotiate prices with the drug companies. The driving force behind that provision was a congressman called Billy Towson. The legislation passed, and about a month or two later, Billy Towson resigned his seat in Congress and went over to Pharma, the lobbying group for the big drug companies, and became the president of Pharma. So the political will in the United States for even doing minor reforms of the way that drugs are regulated or paid for is pretty low. Um, if you want to I mean, one of the things that could be done is you could say that the drug companies should still pay for clinical trials, but they shouldn't decide who would run them. They would give the money to something like the NIH. The NIH would then decide who should run the trials. These people would be independent of the drug companies. The drug companies wouldn't own the data. They could use the data, but they wouldn't own it. They couldn't decide on how the data should be published or where it should be published. So this is one way of partly dealing with this. There are more ways um, that are outlined in an article that I was part of um, in the British Medical Journal in May of 2018. Um, the lead author was a guy named Adam Gaffney, Gaffney. And if you read that article, it talks about how to reform the pharmaceutical ecosystem in the United States and in Canada. And it talks about how to deal with this problem of ghost management.
If I could just ask a follow-up, sorry, Zach. So I agree in like at least my first thought in terms of moving forward is to somehow reform or regulate how the research is conducted, but then would that would the conflict be like would drug companies fight back because they believe it's their like intellectual property? Like is that um do they have a ground to stand on to not
Okay.
allow the research to be done by a third party or the NIH?
Well, they could certainly argue it. I mean, intellectual property is critical to the drug companies. Intellectual
Right.
property means that until the patents expire, nobody else can make that drug. Drug companies and patents typically run for 20 years, but drug companies have found ways of extending it to 30 and more years. So the drug companies would certainly argue that they're the one if they're paying if they own the intellectual property for the product and they're paying for the trials, then they should be the ones who decide who should run the trials and who should own the data from those trials. Um, but and that's an argument that could be made, but it's also an argument that can be overwritten by laws. So you have what's called in the US eminent domain. Have you heard of that? So I own a piece of property. The government decides that they want to build a new highway through that property. They expropriate, they buy that property from me. It doesn't matter whether or not I want to sell it, they can still buy it, and the highway gets built. So they could do the same thing with clinical trials. But the chances that they'll go there are vanishingly small.
Right. And then Trinity.
Hi, Dr. Lexchin. Thank you for the talk. It really was very illuminating. In terms of the like research that is ghost managed or the results are kind of biased and manipulated, how do we, as like students or future doctors, like how do we recognize like patterns or red flags while we're kind of going through new research and seeing that, oh, this might be a biased study, to kind of know what the reality is before we prescribe new medication?
Okay. So the first thing to recognize is that you don't need to learn about an awful lot of different drugs. I mean, if you're a family physician, GP, you can get by with about 100, 150 different drugs. That's really all you need. And you can learn about those. But for the new drugs, um, one of the things is that it takes between 3 and 5 years before serious safety problems come to light with new drugs if they weren't identified in the pre-market clinical trials. So unless you've given up or unless something hasn't worked with people and you've tried everything that's out there, you shouldn't be using new drugs until they've been on the market for about, as I said, 3 to 5 years to make sure that they don't have any serious side effects. Second thing you should be doing is you should be subscribing to one of the bulletins that are out there about about drugs, bulletins that don't have any any ads and that are independent of drug companies. So in the US, that would be the medical letter, which has been published now, I think since the 1950s. Um, and get that. The third thing you should be doing is going to CME that is not being run by the drug companies. Don't go to dinners paid for by drug companies. Don't go to CME that is sponsored by them. Pay for your own. If you're using clinical practice guidelines, make sure that the drug companies were not involved in paying for those. Look at the who is the head of the committee that developed them. Does that person have a relationship with the drug companies? If they do, you should suspect the bias in those clinical practice guidelines. So those are a series of measures that you can take to try and minimize the chance that you're going to be getting biased information.
And then I'll ask another follow-up question. So throughout this internship, there's been kind of a theme of addressing myths that exist about the US medical system, and there's a lot of people in the US who are very prideful, I guess, about the US medical system. And I think one of those potential myths could be the US drives innovation in the pharmaceutical industry. Like other countries benefit from the research that the United States does. Would you say it's accurate to qualify that as a myth, or is the US actually driving pharmaceutical innovation? They're just wildly inefficient at it, and a majority of the drugs that they pump out aren't, like you said, home run hitters, but they do still pump out those home run hitters at a higher rate than, say, another country.
So the first thing you have to recognize is that while most that most nearly all new drugs are marketed by drug companies, and that the majority of drug companies are based in the US, that doesn't mean that the drug companies are the ones that are responsible for the research and development of those products. So there's some good evidence out there that shows that the NIH, for instance, is responsible for the basic research for the majority of new drugs that come on the market. In other words, the NIH develops the finds the molecular receptors, does research into basic physiology, all those things that go into the development of a new drug. The NIH also puts in money for key drugs that that end up being marketed by drug companies. So look at the Moderna mRNA vaccine for COVID. Where did the money to develop that product, that vaccine, come from? Well, it came from the US government. It did not come from Moderna. Moderna may have ended up owning the patent on it, but they didn't pay for its development. Why do the drug companies locate their research in the US. I mean, the research could be done anywhere in the world, really. Um, but they do it in the US. And why do they do it there? They do it there because because the research infrastructure in the US is better than anywhere else in the world. And why is the infrastructure better? Because the US is willing to give the NIH $50 billion a year. It's willing to spend the money that's necessary to train the scientists who can do the research. It has hospitals that are amongst the best in the world. So the drug companies go where the expertise is, and that's in the US. But it's not the drug companies that are responsible for that expertise. It's your public money that's responsible for that. So yes, most new drugs, that the good ones and the bad ones, come from the US, but the drug companies are not necessarily responsible for those drugs. It's the NIH, it's your public system that's responsible for those drugs. And as I said again, or earlier, if you're worried about that there won't be enough money for doing the R&D, stop the share buybacks, stop the dividends, and cut back on the amount of money that's spent on promotion. If you add up the amount of money that's spent on promoting new drugs, it's roughly in the area of $35 billion a year.
And then I'll ask a follow-up question just to clarify. Would you say, I know the R&D component from private drug companies still does, I believe, make up the majority of drug R&D in the United States even.
It does.
Would you say that the majority of that R&D goes towards that large group of non-effective drugs that you showed us at the beginning, the gray portion of that one slide? Or does it go towards, and then maybe public funding goes more towards the blue and orange portion? Or is that misrepresentation?
Nobody has particularly looked at that, but what you can see is that it doesn't cost any more money or any less money to develop important new drugs than it does to develop the garbage that comes out. So if 65% of or 70% of the new drugs that come on the market offer little to no additional therapeutic value, then 65 to 70% of the money that's spent on doing the R&D for those is also being wasted. And to the extent that the drug companies are responsible for the pre-market trials for those drugs, then 65% or 70% of that money is largely being wasted on drugs that are going to make very little difference to your patients. It's not a bad idea to have some degree of choice, just because we know that individual physiology will affect how different drugs work in different people. So you can have three or four ACE inhibitors. You can have three or four different drugs from a particular category. But once you get beyond that, um, the money that's being spent to develop those drugs is largely being spent to generate revenue for the drug companies, not because it's going to help the people that you're going to see. Oh, and by the way, drug company if when drug companies say that it's good to have choice, they're partly right, but they don't. Their clinical trials aren't designed to to help doctors choose. So those clinical trials are not the people who are chosen for them are not people who failed the drugs that are already on the market. Um, they're they're not people who have had side effects from drugs that are already on the market, and drug companies do not necessarily test their new drugs against the best thing that's already on the market. They like to test them on placebos because it's much easier to show that your works better than a placebo than it is to show that your drug works against something that's already out there.
Anana?
What you just said reminded me of one of your slides. I forget which drug it was exactly, but it showed that there were higher mortality rates against versus placebo. Um,
That was Vioxx when
yes, yeah,
given to people to
Vioxx.
try and prevent Alzheimer's.
Yes, thank you. How was that not flagged? Because from what I understood from clinical trials, is if, there's two groups of people and we see that the drug being studied is clearly helping whatever ailment they're trying to treat, you pull everyone that's in the placebo group and you put them on that new drug for ethical reasons. Wouldn't they do the same if they see higher mortality rates and stop the study? Like, where's the IRB? I just don't.
It wouldn't be the IRB. The IRB only approves, says that the trial is going to be
Okay.
ethical. It's
Yeah.
the clinical safety board that would be stopping the trial. So
Mm.
this is an independent body that's set up for most major clinical trials, and they are the ones who actually can look at the data as the trial is ongoing and are supposed to make the decision. This drug is wonderful and everybody should be on it. So we're going to switch people who are on the comparator or placebo, or this drug is awful and we're going to stop the trial. But that all depends on the data that they get. So, how are you recording side effects? So, if somebody is, for instance, suicidal on a new drug, are you going to say that they had suicidal thoughts, or are you going to just say that these people had were were disturbed while they were taking the drug? So disturbed can mean that they were suicidal, but it doesn't necessarily have that same connotation.
Mhm.
Or how are you going to measure the effects? How are you going to record the effects of those drugs? And there are ways that you can manipulate the way that these things are recorded. And if you go back to phase one trials, which are designed to figure out what are the safest doses for a trial, these are ones that are designed, that are run on volunteers, not people with the disease. These are people who want to make money, um, and who want to get medical care. And in the United States, who are those people? Well, they're the uninsured. They're the people who are out living in tents. They're the people who are going to places where you can get free food. And those are the people who are being recruited. And those people want to stay in those trials because they get paid, they get medical care while they're in those trials, and they will do things to stay in those trials. The people who are running those trials know that if the trial has to be terminated because too many people drop out, that their company may not be hired again um, to run that phase 1 trial because it cost the drug company money and they got no results from it. If you want to read about phase 1 trials, you should look for a book by Jill Fisher, Jillfisher. She's a professor somewhere in North Carolina, I think.
Okay. And then it's my understanding, Dr. Lexchin, that we're set to end around noon today. Is that
That's right. That's what I was told.
okay? Um, I'll at this point, if anyone has a question, feel free to unmute. I'll give about maybe 30 seconds, maybe 10 to 15 seconds.
Were there questions in the? I haven't been looking at the chat.
I've been monitoring the chat.
Okay, all right.
Um, but if not, I'd like to give you back the floor, Dr. Lexchin, if you want to leave us with any parting remarks or anything like that.
Um, you people are as your career develops, you're going to have to make your own decisions about drugs. So I've given you my viewpoint on things, and you're going to hear lots of other different viewpoints about how to use prescription drugs. So you've got to make your own decisions, but make them based on the best information that you think is out there. Do it independently. Don't necessarily listen to people like me. Um, and keep thinking about how to use medications as you go through your careers. Don't get stuck in because you were told by your staff 40 years ago that this is the drug to use, that you should keep using it.
Thank you for that advice. I think it's definitely an art that we're all going to spend our entire careers trying to master, but having information like this definitely helps us start on that journey in at least a more educated way.
And buy that book by Jerry Avorn. I think he's a great writer. Um, a lot of it is based on his own personal experience in Boston, at Harvard. So it's a great book.
And then I see Dr. Keller, you popped up. Was there anything you wanted to mention before we let Dr. Lexchin go?
Um, Not particularly, aside from, I do believe that you folks are planning to read the physician's pharmaceutical proposal on the PNHP website. Just wanted to bring that to your attention again. If you haven't read that yet, it would be good to read. Um, because the guests that we're inviting about the pharmaceutical industry may refer to it. That's and just so you know, usually we do have Adam Gaffney speaking with our interns at some point in the internship. This year there was a scheduling of the show. I don't think they got to hear from him. They were just able to watch a recording from him from last year. Is that right? Yeah, thank you.
So the PNHP proposal is the article I referred to. Adam Gaffney and I were the primary authors for that. That was the one in the BMJ in May of 2018.
Right, and that's right on the PNHP website. You don't have to have a subscription to the journal or anything. Great. Well, thank you so much.
Okay, so I think I'll see you guys back next week. All right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.